3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History of Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way. Right, so hello and welcome back to the History of Jackson podcast. Today we welcome back historian, author and friend, Dr. Simon Elliott. How you doing, Simon?
Great stuff. Thank you, Jackson. I love coming on your pod. Thank you for having me back.
No, I love having you on the pod. We always have such great discussions. And I think today, we're talking about Agricola and Scotland, the northern campaigns of Roman Britain's great warrior governor. It's a fantastic book. It's just recently come out. But I wanted to ask you, what inspired you to write this book?
My real passion, as you know, in terms of Roman history is Roman military. And Agricola is a titanic figure in the story of Roman Britain, but also of British history more generally. He's one of the most important figures, actually, in the entirety of British history. Some events occurred in his time in Britain, and he actually served in Britain 3 times, which we'll go on to. But some events occurred then which set in motion the sort of political settlement of Britain we live in today. And what I thought I'd do is actually do my own take on his story, where I set in place his background before he came to Britain, and then his role in the Year of the Four Emperors, to sort of like put in full context the importance of what then happened when he became the governor of Britain and then invaded the far north of Britain. So it's worth remembering, Jackson, that only 2 Romans can claim to have conquered the far north of Britain, even if only both times briefly. One is Agricola, which we'll come on to, and the other one is Septimius Severus, who I'm going to be publishing a book about later this year. So I have 2 books coming out this year about the Romans' attempts to conquer the far north of Britain, which for all of your Scottish listeners, I'm happy to say, failed.
So why was it so difficult for them to conquer the north of Britain?
The Roman way, so firstly, the Romans have provinces, not because it's nice, but because they can make money from them. So it's basically a means of extending imperial territory, where you then plonk a governor in and a procurator in, who then run the province. The governor is the emperor's legal representative and military representative, and the procurator is like the chancellor, who's there to basically rinse the place dry so that the money can go into the imperial fiscus treasury. And that is basically what provinces were. Now, to do that, the Romans were very, very clever. We'll use Britannia as an example. To do that, the Romans were very clever. What they did, they basically, through a conceit really, encouraged the local nobility of the native peoples to buy into the Roman way of life. So to wear togas, to have their sons learn Latin and their daughters, if they were forward thinking, to build grand public buildings in formal Mediterranean style, stone built settlements, etc. And to do that, the Romans lent them loads of money. And once they borrowed the money, they were on the hook. So the reason why the Boudiccan revolt took place is probably because the Roman money, the people who lent the money from Rome to the Iceni tribe in North Norfolk, called the money in. Right? So you need to have an aristocracy and nobility who are willing to try and buy into the way of Roman life. And broadly in Britain, up to the territory of the Brigantes, over a period of years, decades actually, that worked. But you do get some parts around the Roman Empire where people just weren't interested in the Roman way of life. So Scotland is a great example, the far north of Britain, Scotland today, where, to my mind, with a lot of research, the locals up there just weren't having it. They weren't interested. So it wasn't just a story about it wasn't economically viable. I don't believe that at all, actually. You can go to parts of Scotland today and it's just as viable agriculturally, if not much more so, actually, than parts of northern Britain. So I don't think that's the reason. I think it's because the aristocracy there just weren't having it. The Romans tried, and when Agricola tried, he did it with 30,000 men. Severus later tries, he uses 50,000 men. And there's a political incentive then with Agricola because the Flavian emperors want martial glory, with Severus because he's the emperor at the end of his life who wants martial glory. There's a political imperative for the Romans to do it, but as soon as that goes, Agricola's called home, Severus dies in York, then there's no incentive to stay there, and the locals aren't interested. So I do think a lot of it is the locals just weren't interested.
And it's really interesting to hear that it's the draw of culture in the south and the idea that they don't like that Roman culture in northern Britain. But then what was it Britain like before the arrival of the Romans? Was it all the same as what's going off in northern Britain?
Largely, you've got a continental Latine culture, very similar to Gaul before Caesar's conquest. The 2nd century AD, geographer Ptolemy sort of setting out the various tribes in Britain. So, for example, where I am now in Derbyshire, you have the Coral Talvi. North of me, above the River Don, you have the Brigantes. In Kent, you have the Cantiaci. In the Thames Valley, you have the Atrebates. I mean, these are the tribal peoples, confederations or tribes that the Romans certainly, through their own geographers and historians, talk about. Then in Scotland, you've got a similar patchwork of tribes at this period. Broadly, modern authors call them Caledonians. But that's quite confusing, really, because when you get to the Severan campaigns there at the beginning of the 3rd century, by that time, you've seen a real change in the north, and it's backfired on the Romans because although the locals there in the far north aren't interested in the Roman way of life, so they don't buy into sort of the world of Rome, they're perfectly happy to take the money, or political or military support. And what that does actually is start a coalescence of power from, say, 30, 40 tribal entities in the far north to only 2 by the time of Severus. So they are the Mightiae and the Caledonians. So which is why using Caledonians for the Agricolan campaigns is confusing. So I just talk about the Britons of the far north, or Britons, who culturally are very similar to the Britons in the south. It's worth remembering when Hadrian, we think of the far north of Roman Britain as Hadrian's Wall, right? Hadrian's Wall was built straight through Brigantian territory because the Brigantian Confederation, their territory was broadly from a line from the River Dee in Chester through to the Wash, all the way up to almost the Forth and the Clyde line, right? That's a huge amount of territory, and Hadrian's Wall smacked straight through it. And the Romans had no interest in local land ownership. They just did it. So it's like the Berlin Wall being piled through Berlin. So you have this patchwork of tribes in Britain, and then the Romans come over, the invasion that works AD 43, spend over 40 years driving the line of the northern frontier from what is effectively the southeast at the beginning of the Roman occupation of Britain, when the province is created in 43. You have these slices taken out. So 3 of those slices involve Agricola because he came here 3 times.
So why did they invade the British Isles? Because obviously it's quite difficult going from being a continental empire, contiguous, stretching from the east to the tip of Gaul. Why have they now decided to cross to this archipelago?
You make a very good point. So the first thing to remember is the Roman Empire is a Mediterranean empire, right? So actually, the bolt-ons in Gaul and the sort of Rhineland in Germany and things like that, actually, that is sort of like serious Game of Thrones-esque expansion in its own right. Right, so Caesar did that in 6 years in his Gallic Wars in the AD 50s, and then Gaul becomes part of the Roman world and the Rhine frontier. Britain, therefore, is even more fantastical. So you're moving on to Lord of the Rings territory with Britain. You know, this is a land of which the Romans don't know very much. It's across terrifying Oceanus, a sea which is not part of the Roman world, the Mediterranean, which the Romans are scared of. The Romans find it very difficult to invade Britain at all. Augustus planned it 3 times and very cleverly, he's a canny man, Augustus, very cleverly found excuses not to do it. Caligula planned to do it, and he failed because his legionaries wouldn't get on the ships. And then when Claudius invaded in 43, the legionaries had to be shamed into getting on the ships. So invading Britain's a big deal, and it only happens effectively under Claudius because Claudius is an ill-favoured emperor who needs a political win at the outset of his reign. So this is like a proper Hail Mary, you know. But once they're in, these are Romans and they don't want to lose face. It's a PR thing. They make the province work. And broadly, especially if you're in the south and the east, eventually, Roman Britain towards the time of Agricola is not much different to Gaul, really. And it's making money and it's effective. But I always still think Britain was the Wild West of the Roman Empire. And I always think if a Roman emperor after Claudius could find a good excuse to leave Britain, then they would have done. And they never did because they couldn't find a good enough excuse because they didn't want the PR disaster it would be. The reason why it's the Wild West of the Roman Empire is going back to the very beginning of our chat, the far north. Because the far north is never conquered. The Roman military is therefore in Britain probably large compared to the rest of the empire. Because you've got to have at least 3 legions and an equivalent number of auxiliaries. So minimum of 30,000 troops, most deployed in the north and the west, to actually hold that line because it's never fully conquered. And I estimate in my PhD research that Roman Britain usually had about 12% of the entire Roman military establishment in what is usually only about 4% of the geographic area. So it's just a tough place.
And what kind of pressure does that place on the Roman aristocracy and elites? Because obviously politics and military in Rome, Principate, Dominate, Republic, is deeply entwined.
So we'll look at it at two levels. So in terms of the elites in Roman Britain, most of them would be Romano-British, who are generationally members of families who have bought into the Roman way of life. You should note, though, that Britain is the only province in the Roman Empire which did not provide a senator, right? So that is unusual in itself. It is a place of difference. In terms of the Roman elites back in Rome or elsewhere in the empire, Britain, who wants to go to Britain? Unless you want to make your name fighting, who wants to go to Britain? You can imagine sort of Agricola talking to his wife and saying, I've got great news. What's that, Agricola? And I'm going to become the governor of Britain. Really? Can't we just stay here or go to Achaia or go to Asia or go to Africa Proconsularis? No, pack your bags and go to Britain. Silence in the household.
So the first time Agricola ends up going to Britain, why is he going? How has he ended up in that situation?
So the first time he's a junior officer. So Agricola's born in AD 14. He's born in Forum Julii, which is a sort of a coastal town near Marseille. In Narbonensis, so southeastern France. His father is a senator who is executed before he's a year old and maybe before he's 3 months old by Caligula. Because it sounds as though his father was a little bit too fond of his own voice and made a joke or something on a day when it wasn't wise to make a joke with Caligula, but he was executed. But the family retained their wealth, a senatorial level wealth, that's hugely wealthy. And his mother brought him up and then moved him to Marseille to be educated. So the finest education the region could give him. He ended up going to Rome as part of his education as well. And then as a young man, as an aristocrat at senatorial level, he begins his cursus honorum, aristocratic career path. And one of his first postings is to be a junior officer with Legio II Augusta, which is based in Britain at Caerleon in southeastern Wales. Now, intriguingly, it looks as though Agricola was then posted from the legion onto the staff of the governor, because he was quite clever. The governor was Paulinus, and therefore that means that Agricola almost certainly served with Paulinus in the battle where he defeated Boudicca. So firstly, Agricola may well have been at the Battle of Watling Street when Boudicca was defeated.
It's really, really cool to hear those links across his life. But something that struck me when I was reading the book and when you're talking now is that we seem to know an awful lot about Agricola and his movements. Why is that?
It's very unusual to have a full biography of an individual in the classical world. It's almost unheard of. Fortunately, with Agricola we do, because his son-in-law was the historian Tacitus. So nearly everything we know about Agricola comes from his son-in-law. So in a modern historian sense, you and I know you've got to take classical authors with a pinch of salt, take modern authors with a pinch of salt, let's face it. But the key thing here is this is a known, right? That Tacitus was his son-in-law. We therefore know there's going to be a big spin. The book's called The Agricola as well, and it's a full biography. It's one of the first things Tacitus wrote, actually. But in actual fact, it sets out in great detail the key moments in his life. And as a historian, you and I, what we can do is we can then triangulate that with other sources, with the archaeological record of things like that. So broadly, I'm comfortable that even though Tacitus is his son-in-law and is incredibly biased, clearly, we can tell the true story of Agricola by using other sources to balance it.
So it's really cool that someone's like Tacitus actually was able to write the life story of Agricola. But then what kind of sources are you using to triangulate that? And how are they building up a picture that lets us combine everything?
So firstly, Tacitus wrote a number of other books, including the Annals, which tell other stories about Rome and Britain. So we can look at the way he tells the stories about other individuals in Rome and Britain, like Paulinus, to see if we need to put a degree of balance in for his Agricola. And they do show that indeed you do, because Tacitus is not particularly favourable to many other governors in Rome and Britain, but he is to his father-in-law. But then again, you've got other authors as well. We've got a deep literary record. We can use Suetonius, we can use Cassius Dio, other writers, but crucially also with many parts of this story with Agricola, we have the archaeological record, because Agricola served here for a lot of his life, and he campaigns with Paulinus. And then I'll tell you now, actually, it's a way good way of segueing in. Later in his career, he then gets posted back to Britain after the year of the four emperors. So in the year of the four emperors, AD 69, it looks as though Agricola is favouring Vespasian and the Flavians, but not at first. So you have the year of the four emperors, very sanguinous civil war in Rome. Nero commits suicide. Then you get a cascade of candidates coming through, one of whom, Otto, appears to have had his navy raid the home region of Agricola's mother, and Agricola's mother is killed. Okay, so certainly from that point, Agricola, going through Vitellius and then through to Vespasian, Agricola starts favouring Vespasian. Now, Vespasian's first governor in Britain is called Bolanus, and he campaigns in Britain, and he's given the task of going into the far north, the land of the Brigantes, previously unconquered, a supporting tribal state for Rome, actually, an allied state. Vespasian needs an early win with the Flavians, winning in AD 69. It's the end of the Julio-Claudians. We're going to pick a fight. You could pick a fight with the Parthians in the east, pick a fight in the far north of Britain. Parthians, you might lose, whereas you can probably at least manufacture a win in the far north of Britain. So Bolanus is over, and he campaigns as a warrior governor after AD 69. He's replaced by another governor called Cerealis. Cerealis is a supporter of Vespasian, who earlier had actually disgraced himself in the Boudiccan revolt, because he's the guy who led part of Legio 9 Augusta to try and save Colchester from Boudica, and he'd been defeated. Then he spent the rest of the Boudiccan revolt hiding. However, he proved a key supporter of Vespasian in AD 69, and therefore he's made the next governor. And he's tasked with conquering up to the line of what you and I would say is probably the Hadrian's Wall line today, Solway Firth-Tyne. It's in his governorship that Agricola is posted back to Britain. And this is really cool, actually, in terms of the northwest of Britain today, because Agricola's put in charge of Legio 20 Valeria Victrix, and he's in charge of the campaign on the west coast, while Cerealis concentrates on the east coast. And it's Agricola who sort of helps found York. Sorry, it's Agricola who helps found Chester. It's Agricola who founds Manchester. It's Agricola who founds Carlisle. So many of the urban settlements we have on the west coast of Britain today, the really big important ones, they were founded by Agricola in this campaign, which is in the early to mid AD 70s. So that's the second time he comes to Britain, but he's not the governor yet.
So how is he getting on with his governor and the political key players in Rome? Because he seems to have played a slight game or taken advantage of situations to help himself progress.
I think that's a very good point, actually. I'd say he's quite shrewd and canny, in actual fact. It's very difficult in the context, you know this yourself with your own research and your own specialisations. If you have a civil war, it's a zero-sum game, isn't it? You can't sit on the fence, you've got to pick a side. And if you pick the wrong side, you're gone. That's it. Game over. There's no coming back from that. And I think he played a very canny game in the year of the four emperors, actually. He may have supported the Flavians personally, but once he got the excuse of his mother being killed by Otto's troops, he basically pounced on the opportunity. And from that point, actually, his career really did. I mean, he'd done okay anyway, but his career really did begin to thrive. And I think he very cannily put in place a network of supporters in Rome who later had to lobby on his behalf after he fell out with the Emperor Domitian. And he ends up with this series of plum postings. I mean, he's the golden boy. He's the golden boy of the Roman military. I mean, if you want a troubleshooter, Agricola is your man. You know, he's proved himself. He's fought against Boudica. He's conquered the north of modern England. He's founded what become later great cities, etc. And then in that campaign with Cerealis, who's on the east coast, he's very clever because actually he makes sure Cerealis gets all the credit back in Rome. Very clever. Good PR operator. Not as good as Caesar, but getting there.
So how does he end up becoming governor of Britannia? Because at this point, he's second in command and he goes back to Rome and takes several other roles.
So again, he's on his cursus honorum, remember? So what he's doing is basically being given every year or two a new posting. It could be a military posting, it could be a civilian posting, and that's what happens with him. Back in Britain, we have this roll of warrior governors in the early Flavian period, all of whom are tasked with gaining martial favour for the Flavians, Vespasian, Titus, and then later Domitian, one of my least favourite Roman emperors. We can come on to that. Bolanus is the first one. Cerealis is the second one. The third one is called Frontinus. While Frontinus is the governor, was back in Rome. But then, at the end of Vespasian's reign stroke life, he turns to Agricola and says, right, I actually want you, because he clearly is an emperor. I think he knows it at the end of his life. And he's looking for one last mighty piece of martial valor. He says to Agricola, can you conquer the far north of Britain for me? You know, this Conradian heart of darkness, as it would have been thought of in Rome. And Agricola has been given the plum posting, is given the governorship in Britain. And he arrives, and the first thing he does is to campaign in Wales, in actual fact. So you have in AD 77, when Agricola arrives as the governor, the Romans still haven't fully conquered the north of Wales. They were in the process of it with Paulinus, and then you had the Boudiccan revolt in 60-61. And since then, the Romans have had a holding campaign in northern Wales. Agricola's first campaign, in actual fact, is against the Welsh.
And why? I think there's several different campaigns that he takes or considers that makes you think about the interconnectivity of the British tribes. So why is he going to Wales first before going to set out on his aim to go to Scotland?
I think it goes back to the point that a procurator in a province, procurator is the number two after the governor, his job is to rinse the province dry of all its money and wealth and natural resources. And in northern Wales, you've got a huge amount of sort of natural resources, metals and things like that. And also the sort of most of coastal Wales has already been conquered, and the southeast has been conquered, very fertile area. And therefore, it's basically just ticking the box and also making sure he doesn't have a potential enemy to his rear. So it's finishing off what the Romans began in Wales and also protecting his rear before he actually launches this mighty Tolkien-esque campaign into the far north of Britain.
So that Tolkien-esque campaign, how does he prepare for it? How does he set up going towards the north of Britain?
Agricola is not only a very good field commander and a very good strategic commander, he's a very good logistician. So if you're going to take 30,000 men, and he took basically parts of 4 legions and an equivalent number of auxiliaries, so 30,000 men, taking those into hostile enemy territory, you're going to have an amazing logistics chain in place. And to do that, it's got to be safe. There is a school of thought that says that although by this time the border in Roman Britain was formalised on the line of the Solway Firth Tyne, later Hadrian's Wall, the north of the province was never really pacified by the Romans, because there's a lot of ill feeling with the local Brigantes in particular. Think about Hadrian's Wall being smashed through their territory. And the Romans, I think of the Vindolanda tablet, which calls the local Britons Britanculii, meaning filthy little Britons. So I don't think there's certainly no love lost between the Romans in the far north of Britain and the native Brigantes in the far north of Britain. And I think Agricola, his first campaign after Wales is in AD 78. It's not in Scotland at all, actually. It's in northern England. And what he does, he builds a series of forts to lock down the local population and anchor the Roman presence there, so that not only is his rear secure in northern Wales, but his rear is now also secure in the north of England.
30,000 troops is an awful lot. It's an awful lot for this period of time. So how do the Britons kind of respond to such a huge number of troops marching through the north of England and into North Britain?
They really struggle, actually. It's interesting. Agricola is on his A game, absolutely on his A game. In the next campaign, this is in AD 79, when he goes into the far north. And here, actually, it's almost his most successful campaign in Britain, because he hammers through the Scottish borders and then goes through Fife and into the Upper Midland Valley. And effectively, he's already pacified up to the Highland line by the end of AD 79. I think actually the natives there, the natives in the far north of Britain, really weren't expecting this level of Roman engagement, and I think they really struggled to fight against it. The archaeology here really helps us, because at the end of every day's march in Roman territory, they build a marching camp, which is a temporary fort, and because we can match those to the size of the force, we can actually see on a dot to dot in modern Scotland where Agricola went. So we can follow all his campaigns. And the one in AD 79 was an incredibly successful campaign, where the natives had no opportunity really to coalesce against him in fighting a major battle.
So when such a threat is posed to North Britons, do they come together, or do they start to throw each other under the bus with the Romans?
Bit of both. It's a bit of both, but initially, I think it's actually the latter, because what seems to be happening is the natives who don't want to stay in Roman-occupied territory flee to the northeast. So they're going through a gap between the Highland Line, a narrow gap between the Highland Line and Stonehaven on the coast, and then up into the Grampians and towards the Moray Firth. And those who stay, in some way, shape, or form, must have thought they could make some accommodation with the Romans. And the Brigantes, remember, went up into the Scottish border, so the Brigantes would have already had experience south of the Roman frontier about incorporation to the Roman world. And if you're given a choice between staying and bowing down to the emperor, even if only for a short period, or just fleeing with whatever portable wealth you've got, a lot, I think, stayed. Certainly Agricola, he decided to stay because he then built a series of consolidation forts at the end of AD 79, and the Roman troops stayed. And then in AD 80, instead of mounting another campaign chasing after those fleeing to the northeast, he actually had another consolidation year. So he basically built a series of what we call glen blocker forts, blocking the glens on the Highlands line from the Highlands, which are the natural entry points into the lowlands. The glen blocker forts blocked them. So he built a series of forts which effectively sealed off the Highlands from the lowlands. And remember, he's got his Classics Britannica fleet as well on the coast, which is sealing off the coast. So those Britons that were left had to behave or else.
It was really interesting when you mentioned the naval forces there. It was really interesting seeing his use of naval forces, sending them around the British Isles, but also in having a look at Ireland. So why was he using his naval forces in this way, and why was he having a look at Ireland?
For the Romans, their navy was an extension of their army, and they basically used it to control sort of open blue ocean when necessary, but more often than not, the navy played a role in the littoral and down river systems when the Roman army were on campaign. And certainly the Romans tended to supply their legionary spearheads when they were on campaign through the river systems. So Agricola built a series of logistics bases in northern England and the Scottish borders, all on river systems, and they were supplied by ships of the Classics Britannica, which came at the coast from further south on the east and west coast, and then went down river systems. And Agricola also built a series of fortified harbours as he progressed north into modern Scotland, so that he had logistics bases where these ships could go to. Ireland's a very interesting point, actually, because if you move on to the next campaign in AD 81, the part of Britain which the Romans hadn't conquered to that point in the far north, in the lowlands certainly, was the southwest of Scotland. So he goes into the territory of the Britons in the southwest of Scotland and campaigns there. And towards the end of the campaigning season, he coalesces his fleet in the Solway Firth, and he asks permission from the Emperor Domitian. So Vespasian's now dead. Titus is now dead. So Domitian, the younger son of Vespasian, far more ill-favoured, not a military man, wanting martial success of his own on the Danube, so not that interested in Britain. Agricola asked him for permission to invade Ireland, thinking that he can conquer Ireland with his fleet and one legion, which he probably couldn't, but that's what he thought. But intriguingly, Domitian says no. So from that point on, the story of the second largest island in the British archipelago, Ireland, goes in a different political direction to the largest island. If the Romans had conquered Ireland and it had all become one main province, we don't know, but maybe the story of modern Britain and Ireland might be different. But Domitian said no. Intriguingly, in Chester, it would appear as though Agricola was planning to use Chester as his new capital, not London, but Chester, if he had conquered Ireland, because Chester more or less sits right in the centre of this unified province. If he had done, but he didn't. And intriguingly, in Chester from the Agricolan period, you have really big, grand buildings being built, which seem very out of place in the middle of the legionary fort at Chester. The feeling is that is where he would have governed this unified province from. But because the Domitian said no, he didn't invade Ireland, so therefore the buildings weren't completed.
That point about Domitian is really interesting, because you're mentioning he's not a military man. He's refused Agricola's permission to go to Ireland. How does that affect him politically, given he's been the golden boy under Vespasian and Titus?
Well, ultimately he's assassinated, so this is all part of the narrative towards him being assassinated later. Very unpopular emperor, vainglorious. His father was a great warrior who served across the empire and became the emperor, started a new dynasty. His son, his elder brother Titus, also a great famed warrior, taking over from his father in defeating the great First Jewish Revolt, and sadly, though, only was emperor for about a year before he died. And then Domitian takes over. Not been a warrior, not travelled around the empire with his father campaigning as Titus had, desperate to prove that he's as good as the rest of them. So he basically decides he's going to focus his own campaigns on the river Danube. Again, he's unsuccessful, at least initially. He's ill-favoured. But Domitian, at this point, has little interest in his father and elder brothers' campaigns in the far north of Britain. He just inherits it, and you can almost get this sense that he wants everything wrapped up, and he wants to be able to deploy troops away from Britain, which he later does, and to help him with his own campaigns on the Danube. That's why you go into AD 82 with Agricola being ordered by Domitian to wrap things up. So he goes into the far north in AD 82, and once he's there, he reconsolidates the territory conquered previously, and then he begins to plan his campaign north of Stonehaven into the Grampians and into the sort of coastal Moray Firth. It's the only time the Romans actually campaigned so far north in so great numbers. And then it's AD 83 when he mounts the actual full campaign into that very, very far north, sort of around Aberdeen, in Aberdeenshire, etc. And this is what leads to the final meeting engagement. So this is the first time we have mention of a major meeting engagement in any of his campaigns, where we have the Battle of Mons Graupius, which to my mind is probably in the Benaki range in the Eastern Grampians, because it seems to fit the descriptions were given by the primary sources. And that's a full fat battle, mate.
So how is he able to capture all of Britain? Because you said at the beginning he's one of two. It's him and Severus, which is a fantastic, it's such a fantastic achievement. And that battle, how was he able to be one of those two people?
Okay, so Agricola was even more successful than Severus, because Severus never gotten further north than Stonehaven. His plan, I think, was just to conquer the lowlands of Scotland. Agricola, Domitian saying, get it over with, wants to actually bring the Britons to a concluding battle, after which the Britons have lost. This battle, by the way, has huge similarities to the Culloden campaign in the 18th century, because Cumberland's line of march to bring Bonnie Prince Charlie to battle was very similar, it would appear, to Agricola's. And one wonders, actually, if Cumberland had been reading his Tacitus to actually see how Agricola was so successful. But Agricola takes parts of his 4 legions, most of his auxiliaries, fleet on the coast, pursues the fleeing Britons into the territory of the far northern Britons there. And the far northern Britons, we are told by Tacitus, gather under the command of a chieftain called Calgacus. We don't know if he existed or not. And then Calgacus, we are told by Tacitus, then has this major sort of campaign, and the Battle of Mons Graupius takes place. And in the battle, it's very interesting. Calgacus deploys his troops uphill on the slopes of a mountain. So let's say it's one of the Eastern Grampians. And Agricola only uses his auxiliaries to defeat them. Why is that? Well, I think actually Agricola, it's much easier in the Roman world for auxiliary units to have replenishment of casualties, because they tend to come from one area. And a lot of the British auxiliary units came from the Rhine Delta, sort of Belgium, Northern Holland, and the Rhineland. So it's easy to get over battlefield replacements from there than it is for the legions, who are usually recruited in the Mediterranean somewhere, maybe Italy or Spain or North Africa. And I think the 4 legions he had, which are 2 Augusta, 9 Hispana, 14 Germina, which is an elite legion, by the way, and 20 Valeria Victrix. I think they were all really under strength after 5 or 6 years of campaigning. And I don't think Agricola wanted to lose a legion, because it would be very bad PR. Think about AD 9 and the Varian disaster, when Varus lost 3 whole legions in the Teutoburg forest. Huge disaster for the Romans, badly affected the military psyche from that point onwards. I think that's exactly what's going on here. I think Agricola doesn't want to lose any of his 4 legions because they're under strength, so he gets the auxiliaries to do the fighting, but it proves enough. And he wins, and the Britons flee, and the far north is conquered, and Agricola orders his Class Britannica to circumnavigate Britain, and we have a few months, let's say 6 months from that point, sometime in AD 83, when the Romans can claim that they've conquered the far north of Britain. And for once, mate, Domitian shows an interest in Britain, because the good news arrives, and he, of course, appropriates it. So he orders the monumental arch to be built in Richborough on the east coast of Kent, which is the imperial gateway into Roman Britain. This is a quadriform arch, which is possibly the biggest arch in the whole Roman Empire, actually, clad in Carrara marble, which is imported from Italy. And this becomes a fixture for 2 centuries in Roman Britain. You can probably see it from Gaul. And that's what Agricola, Domitian does to celebrate this victory, the fact that Agricola's won the Battle of Mons Graupius, the fact he's circumnavigated the fleet. The whole of Britain's one province for this very short period of time. Hurrah! Everyone's a winner.
So this is Agricola at his peak, his political apogee.
Yes.
What happens to him here? Because he's got to be probably a huge threat to Domitian.
I think actually, it's interesting, that doesn't come through the primary sources. They tend to portray Agricola as a victim, but clearly, if you have a vainglorious emperor who probably has an inferiority complex against anybody who's got military success, I'll go back to my point about Agricola being the golden boy military figure across the entire empire. He's the guy that you would call in if you've got a problem. If you want to conquer the Danubian frontier, go north of the Danubian frontier, who are you going to call? It's not Ghostbusters, it's going to be Agricola. But Domitian doesn't, because he doesn't like it. And I think you make a very good point, actually. I think we have hard evidence, don't we? We know that the Romans don't stay in the far north, full stop. That's it. It's a smoking gun. Agricola's recalled back to Rome, and that's the end of his career, effectively. He lives a few more years and then dies. There's no hard evidence he was poisoned by Domitian, but he might have been. While he's back in Rome, he's given no further job on the Cursus Honorum. He's effectively retired from public life because Domitian doesn't want him to outshine him. The Romans in the far north of Britain gradually are recalled until the reign of Trajan, when they're now back on the line of the Solway, Firth and Tyne, and then later Hadrian builds his wall there. But by then Agricola's dead. And Tacitus doesn't write the Agricola until Agricola is dead. And I think it's Tacitus's way, actually, of just recording his father's great achievements, because we're historians, we're dealing with snapshots in time, and this snapshot in time, you can imagine Tacitus thinking, my father-in-law's dead, he's a great man, but no one will be allowed to talk about it because of this idiot of an emperor. So I'm going to put it down in writing, and we get this fabulous piece of, very biased, but fabulous piece of history. So it's a really sad end, actually, to Agricola's story. Within a few years of literally being the golden boy of the Roman military, he's dead, dying a natural death because he's just removed from public life.
And I think it really shows the story of Rome, to be honest, that the people who are either holding it up or being its greatest successes represent a huge threat to very unstable and anxious, lacking in self-esteem emperors.
I think it's spot on. You're a sort of a world-leading expert on totalitarian regimes, and the Roman Empire is one of the classic examples, if not the classic example, of a totalitarian regime. The psychology of an emperor surrounded by people who'll only tell him what he wants to hear. There are parallels in the world today, well, the world today perhaps, but you get a Roman emperor literally surrounded by people who will only tell him what he wants to hear. The chain of command can then start to break down, and you can see here that the Roman Empire at this time anyway wasn't using its best resources, Agricola, for its foreign policy needs, just simply because it's an extreme version of a totalitarian regime with Domitian, who, let's remember, is assassinated, of course, because he becomes so unpopular.
No, I think that's
I was going to say, Jackson, actually, one thing to remember, though, is in the world in which we live today, Agricola is still important because he was this great warrior governor. I'll go back to my point there about Ireland. So the political history of Ireland is different from that point. Also, because Domitian recalls Agricola and the Roman military dropped down from a conquered far north, the story of the far north of Britain goes its own different direction today. So you can say the Calcutta Cup, if you both of us are passionate about rugby, the Calcutta Cup has its roots in Agricola and Domitian. Because Scotland and England sort of fighting tooth and nail for the Calcutta Cup, fabulous event every year, because Domitian was, let's just say, he's one of my least favourite Roman emperors. I won't use a swear word on your lovely podcast, but he's one of my least favourite Roman emperors. So you have the story of the modern islands of Britain being affected today by events from Agricola's time as governor in Scotland and in Ireland. You have the built environment in Britain reflecting his time as a commander of a legion or a governor. We've spoken already about Chester, Manchester and Carlisle as examples. It's the Flavian campaigns with Agricola, where you get a lot of the forts built on the northern frontier as well. So things like Newcastle, etc., they date to forts built by Agricola. And also his memory is remembered and culturally appropriated in our world. So you can go and see the 19th century statue of Agricola in the Roman baths in Bath. You can go and see the statue of Agricola at the town hall in Manchester. You can go and see the image of Agricola amongst the long line of famous Romans in Britain in the beautiful wall painting in the National Gallery in Scotland. So he's all around us still. Agricola's all around us still. Truly, truly one of the great Britons.
I am incredibly grateful for them and the Calcutta Cup, because it does, and I do agree with the point, it does create this distinct difference without that Roman conquest. And I do fully agree with you, but without that conquest in Ireland and Scotland, it does create this difference where you see in the medieval period and the conflict between the Scottish kings and the English kings and the differences with Ireland as well. Now, I think that's a nice point, Simon, to go to our final fun question. As you know, we do every episode, and we've already mentioned rugby, so I think it would be, and particularly in the time that we're recording this, I think it would be amiss to not discuss rugby. So at this point, when this episode is released, the Lions tour would have finished. But I want to ask you, who do you think will be the Lions tour player of the tour?
Cool, blimey, that's a fantastic question. Finn Russell.
Why do you think Finn
Straightforward.
Russell?
Because I just think he's a superb player, and you can watch Finn playing rugby in the Calcutta Cup, and you can see in him the embodiment of the resistance of the Britons of the far north to the Roman province in the south.
I think that's a lovely answer.
The Britons in the far north just weren't having it.
I love that. I think that's a brilliant question, and I do hope Finn does power us. Well, I think he will anyway. I think he'll power us to a series tour victory. And then, obviously, if people want to get a copy of Agricola in Scotland, where can they go?
It's available on all well-known online marketplaces, and it's available in all well-known bookshops on the high street too. So it's Agricola in Scotland through lovely Pen and Sword. And mate, thank you so much for having me on. I would love talking to you. The great thing about the outcome of Scotland and Ireland not being part of the story of the main island of Britain, but being different, is that it gives you and I loads of things to talk about in history. So even we're winners, everyone's a winner.
I totally agree with that, mate. And I really enjoy having you on the podcast. So thank you very much for coming on again, man.
Pleasure. Talk to you soon.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History with Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way.